MHRA annual lecture, which this year is being given by Sir John Bell. As you're probably aware, John is a Canadian by birth, but most of his professional career has been spent in Oxford, and where he's now Regius Professor, the King's Professor, or the Queen's Professor, and he's in charge, as it were, of the whole medical school. But in addition, he has the day job. He also has done a huge amount of work in the development of policy. And a couple of years ago or so, we published the Life Sciences Strategy, and I think that's what you're going to be talking about mainly today. I was on the board, and he handled us extremely well.
Thank you, Sir Mike, and good evening, everyone. I would really just like to echo Sir Michael's words and say how delighted we are to welcome everyone here this evening. It's wonderful that we have people in the audience from right across the healthcare system, industry, the voluntary sector, patients, academia and government, and we're all really looking forward to Sir John's lecture. In fact, it's the 14th MHRA annual lecture since Alistair Breckenridge, our previous chair, initiated the first one in the 2000s during his time in the chairing role. And it is a very special event for MHRA indeed. It's become a fixture in the regulatory calendar. We've heard from notable speakers from right around the world, but really none could be more relevant or more timely than tonight's lecture. It's brilliant that Sir John will be speaking about the life sciences strategy at this defining moment for the MHRA's future, with the transformation of regulation from a watchdog to an enabler of the life sciences. So this lecture promises to be a landmark in our regulatory evolution, with real potential to help us to shape the UK's groundbreaking life sciences strategy. So we're hugely looking forward to hearing Sir John's observations, particularly on what role you see for the MHRA in all of this, and how by all parts of the life sciences ecosystem working together, collectively we can tackle some of the most significant healthcare challenges facing the world today. Before I hand over to Sir John, I just wanted to say one or two words as interim CEO. It is an enormous privilege for me to have taken on the role at this time in the agency's evolution. And together with our corporate team, we are developing an ambitious strategy to build on our unique assets, basic science, real-world evidence, and of course, innovative regulation. A strategy which will enable innovative products to reach patients safely and more quickly. So now, please join me in welcoming Sir John Bell to deliver the 2019 MHRA lecture, The Future of Life Sciences, Keeping the UK at the Forefront of Medical and Scientific Excellence.
Terrific, thanks very much indeed, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And as you know, regulation featured pretty prominently in the report. Most of you will know I read it unless you've got a bad case of insomnia. But the reality is that regulation is pretty central to many of the things that we put in the report, and I'd like to touch on some of those later in the meeting. It was interesting because earlier in the week I got a call from one of my friends in Whitehall, and they said, "You're giving a speech this week." I said, yeah. They said, "Is it at the MHRA?" I said, yeah. They said, "Are you going to cause trouble?" I said, "Yeah, I might." And they said, "Well, that might not go over so well." I said, "Well, when you start paying me, you can start telling me what I said." So anyway, get ready for the ride. And just to be clear, I make no decisions in the place. I just hang around and cause trouble. So this was the report which we published 2 years ago. I had a huge amount of help from many people in the room who helped us put this together. And it was, I think, a really helpful step to try and get academia, the NHS, the industry, broadly defined pharma, biotech, diagnostics, digital industries together, and to try and think hard about what the future of the UK might be, and to identify the real opportunities that might be out there for us to grow our research base, but also our economic base in the life sciences. And this was very much part of Greg Clark's industrial strategy plans, and indeed we got out of the gate, I think, before everybody else. And it'll be for others to say, but I think we probably make a better job of this than most of the other sectors. So the fundamentals that we started with, though, were pretty good. As you know, the UK has got this spectacular science base. We've got 3 of the top 20 medical research programs in the world, and we've got 2 of the top universities in the world. So for a pretty dinky little island in the North Sea, we do pretty well in that space, and I think that's really the foundations of everything that follows. We've also, of course, got the largest biotech cluster outside the US, and probably the 3rd biggest to San Francisco and Boston. Crucially, though, we do have this broad single-payer cradle-to-grave healthcare system that comes with a data infrastructure, which I'll come back to in a minute, because I think it is one of our unique selling points. We have the largest and most innovative drug regulator in Europe, and I'll come back to why that's crucially important for this overall strategy. And we are the most productive sector in the UK economy. Now, just to give you some sense about where and how this has evolved over the past 15 years, there's been a massive amount of investment in capital infrastructure to support the science base in the UK. And this is just a few examples of really very major campuses that can stand up nose to nose with even the biggest campuses in the US. The Addenbrooke's campus, of course, with AstraZeneca at its heart. The Old Road campus, which has got about 2,500 scientists, and is a brand new campus in Oxford. The Crick, of course, which is the flagship institute in London, which has been enormously successful. The Sanger Centre and the EBI in Hingston. And the Harwell campus, which has got the interface between physical sciences and life sciences in that domain. Now, each one of these would be something that most countries would die to have, but you know, we've got many of them, and I think they're full of really talented and able scientists making progress on both discovery and development issues on a daily basis. The Golden Triangle, of course, is pretty central to our agenda. It doesn't mean that there aren't other really good things going on in the country, but this is the thing that I think really does differentiate us. Both Oxford and Cambridge have about 200 biotech companies in them. Cambridge obviously has the LMB and the Sanger Centre. In Oxford, we've got slightly larger biotech companies and a number of unicorns, but also the Rosalind Franklin Institute and the Harwell site. But London is sort of the sleeping giant, because London has a really emerging innovation ecosystem, which has been immensely powerful, and it's sufficiently diffuse, rather difficult to count biotech companies. So they have at least 100, they may have 200 biotech companies, but crucially, they're also a major financial center. So if you actually compare ourselves to either San Francisco or Boston, two of the major differentiating features are A, we've got the NHS, and B, we have a major financial center right at the heart of our biggest cluster, and that is and will continue to prove a major advantage in terms of economic growth. Now, where do we start with? This is work that we put together for the report, which shows just how good the UK system actually was. And if you look at the top panel, public spend per weighted publication, a small number here is good, a big number is bad. But you can see, compared to our competitor countries, US, Germany, France, Israel, we do pretty well in this space. So from a just pure academic publication perspective, we are easily the best out of those 5 countries, and actually probably the best in the world. In the second panel, though, this is not so good. Weighted publications per patient, the high number is not helpful, and it means that for the publications we have very much fewer patents than many of these other countries, and that there's a very important piece there that we have to remember if we're going to grow the economic base here. Jobs per public spend, a big number is good. We have lots, and we do much better in terms of jobs created per public spend in this space. And GVA, gross value added per public spend, is also, we're easily the best. Israel a close second, but well ahead of the US and Germany francs. So the fundamentals, I think we sort of all could have guessed that we were here, but it's nice to have the data to support it. UK productivity is also a big problem. You've heard it, it was in the news again today. It's fallen again. UK productivity is a big issue for economic growth, and the government is very worried about it. So it was interesting as part of the report to try and lay out the different sectors in the UK economy and see who was productive and who wasn't. And as you can see, the most productive sector in the UK economy is pharmaceuticals and chemicals, with pharmaceuticals, I think, accounting for much of that productivity gain. So in fact, if you're trying to boost productivity by boosting pharmaceutical activity all the way through to manufacturing, you can have quite a big impact on the overall productivity of the country. You look across all the other sectors and you can see declining levels of productivity. You can see the guys all the way over on the right are the least productive in the country. Perhaps not surprisingly, they're very good at shuffling papers. They may make money, but they don't make anything else of value. So that's why their productivity appears so low on the figures. But yeah, all these things have caught the UK government attention, and it's one of the reasons why we are very much a focus of attention. So the life sciences strategy, just to summarize broadly what it said, was that we needed to continue to strengthen the science base. There's more that can be done. We in particular have to strengthen higher risk science, and there are now some programs in place to try and do that. Obviously, further enhancing clinical trials. There's a good program in clinical trials and translational science, largely led by the MHRA. We need to do more and work closer with industry if we can. We need to facilitate the scaling of innovative companies. So we have historically had the most biotech companies and the most products under development in biotech companies in the whole of Europe. But we have never scaled a substantial company in the UK to a company that makes products, pays tax, employs people in the conventional way that mid-sized biotech companies do. So that's a major issue that we addressed, and I'll come back to that later. In terms of discovery, development, and manufacturing, we also made the recommendation that we needed to focus on the new generation of therapeutics. It's well known, I think, to all of you that we kind of missed the antibody thing. Antibodies were clearly discovered at the LMD in Cambridge. But then the whole commercial development of the antibody story took place starting in Genentech and then elsewhere. UK pharma was slow to pick it up, in fairness, and the country lost the opportunity to exploit antibody technology at scale. It's crucially important we don't miss the next platform, and the next platform is clearly going to be in this area of viral vectors, nucleic acid-based therapies, and I'll come back to talk about that a bit in a minute. But I think we are really now on the front foot, I think, to seize that opportunity. And there's a crucial regulatory piece to that, because the truth is people don't really know how to regulate and manage that in the system. We set out to try and fix the adoption problem in the NHS, which was real. And we also thought about the possibility of creating a new independent regulator, which I'll come back and talk about. Please don't get too twitchy yet. I'll come back and talk about that later. But central to the strategy was the idea that we needed to create some new industries. So there wasn't a lot of point in creating another pharmaceutical company. We have two very good ones. It's actually quite hard to create a new pharmaceutical company. So what we needed to do to decide is what in the life sciences were going to be major areas of economic growth. And let's build capacity so that we can build major companies in those three domains. And that formed the heart of the report. And we chose three areas which I think you'll probably agree were pretty good bets. The first one was genomics. We are, I think without a shadow of a doubt, the leading country in the world in the genomic domain. In there's a whole variety of things, from diagnostic technologies, sequencing technologies, precision medicine. It enables target discovery, and it has a very important place to play in public health. So that was a domain that we wanted to pursue. The second one was this area of digital health. The availability of large-scale records from the healthcare system does provide a real opportunity for the UK. And we actually have unique sets of records. The NHS is a remarkable resource for this. And the idea of using this to try and create real opportunities for generating better products for patients is one that we came on very quickly. And the third area was an area which wasn't immediately obvious until we started to talk about it at the board, on which Mike and some of the others in the room talked about. But it became clear if you talked about where healthcare was going in the next 20 years, one of the things we have to do is we have to shift the focus of healthcare from late-stage interventions from people with end-stage disease, which is largely what we treat at the moment, to a much more progressive program of trying to identify people at very high risk of diseases, intervening in that setting with public health interventions, behavioral change, but also diagnosing their diseases early so you can intervene early. And there's a whole set of new tools that should make that available. So we decided that if you were thinking about where healthcare was going to be 20 years from now, there's no question that this early diagnosis piece is going to be a crucial piece of the puzzle. So let me talk first of all about the genetics. The UK has this terrific heritage in the genetic space, starting all the way back with Darwin, who didn't know anything about genetics, but discovered the reason why genetics actually exists, which is evolution. And then from there, Archibald Garrett, who was the first to describe the genetic basis of disease, both rare and common diseases. Watson and Crick, you all know about the discovery of the structure of DNA. Fred Sanger, who was the first to really discover how you could sequence DNA at scale. And then Alec Jeffreys and Ed Southern, who developed both chip technology, which is now becoming very important, but also how you quantitate variation around the human genome. And of course, the UK played an important role in all the major projects, all the way back to the human genome, which took 10 years to do and cost about $3 billion to sequence the first human genome. Then the identification of single nucleotide variants across the genome, the linkage of those variants to disease with GWAS studies, which was led by Peter Donnelly, and then a whole variety of contributions in the sequencing domain and the deeper sequencing domain. So the UK has really had a leading place in all these programs, and there have been a set of characters, interesting characters, who've been involved in all this. Shankar Balasubramanian, as you know, in Cambridge, discovered the Solexa technology, which has now gone on to be the single commonest sequencing technology used in genomics around the world. This is a good example of a company that should have stayed in the UK and didn't. It's now based in San Diego. Hagan Bailey in Oxford has discovered the nanopore technology. That's the successor to Illumina. That technology is now really starting to work at scale and has a really exciting prospect of generating both long and accurate reads over large bits of the genome. And Peter Donnelly, who really was the first to exploit common variant DNA variants to be able to understand how, when you aggregate those, you get very, very impressive risk profiles in single individuals. So that probably will be the way that this is most impactful on the healthcare system. Now, you spot the odd one out. Anyway, he's not really the odd one out, because, I guess it's fair to say it wasn't perfect for David Cameron, but one of the things that did work really well was it was he who supported the creation of Genomics England. And without Genomics England, without him, we would not have Genomics England. And it was he who recognized the real opportunity of genomics in the UK and gave real a push from number 10 to make all that stuff happen. So he deserves a lot of credit for that, and was really central and important for that particular step. So the UK is now in this really remarkable place. It's got really three major planks in its program. One is UK Biobank. Mike has chaired for many years. 500,000 people deeply phenotyped in a whole variety of ways, but now has turned out to be the real core of our genetics insights into disease and phenotypes in human populations. It's a global resource. It's used by everybody all over the globe. It's been supported by the funders faithfully over a long period of time. And when we created Biobank, we absolutely thought that it would be a huge resource for genetics. It was just that in 2002, 2003, nobody really knew that you would be able to do genomics at scale, which we now can do. And so there have been single nucleotide variants tested across the whole cohort, exomes now almost completed across the whole cohort, and a project started a month ago to do genomes across the cohort. So that's a really exciting, venture, which is undoubtedly the world's most genetically characterized cohort. The other corner is Genomics England. That's David Cameron's program, 100,000 genomes completed in 4.5 years on time. A terrific story in rare disease, a bit of work still to do in cancer, but a really exciting program which will now be turning out 100,000 genomes a year for the NHS to study rare disease genetics in patient populations. So this is the first genetic program in a healthcare system delivering large-scale data, which is accessible also for research scientists based on the consent that's been signed. And then the third piece of this is going to use the common variant SNP panel to score large numbers of chips, probably 1 million SNPs across a population of 5 million people. This is a cohort which I'll talk about in a minute, but it's one that has profound implications for public health because it does provide these really exciting high-risk profiles. So there isn't any country in the world that can show this as where they are in this particular domain. And so I think there are enormous opportunities of exploiting that. The genome program in Biobank, this is just we launched this a month ago. This is a slide I made for that, but it's the world's largest whole genome program. It was funded by 4 pharmaceutical companies, as well as the sequencing capabilities of Decode in Iceland and the Sanger Center. And it remarkably is going to take them 2 years to sequence 500,000 genomes and at a whole genome level, when the first genome, which was only 1991 to 2001, cost $3 billion to sequence one genome, and it took them 10 years. So you can see the pace of change in this. We're currently writing a national genomic strategy. This just lays out the 3 legs which I've just described to you. Clinical genomics from Genomics England, studying rare variants at a whole genome level. Genotype-phenotype stuff in Biobank, which uses both common and rare variants. And then public health genomics, which is focused around this new cohort, which will be looking entirely at common variant SNPs to help us with the public health agenda. So that I think is a great foundation. Now the second domain that I mentioned is this area of big data. This is a really extremely exciting area, and the UK is uniquely positioned to exploit this. And of course there are whole different sets of data from the healthcare domain that can go into this: pathology and imaging, therapeutic interventions, clinical phenotype lab tests, digital monitoring, genomics, a whole variety of different sets. And they all go to creating new algorithms, which are just starting to appear in this space, and which I think are going to be profoundly impactful on all healthcare systems, because they will make decision-making more efficient, it will allow you to save money, and it will make all healthcare systems much more efficient. The data, as I said in the last slide, comes from a whole variety of different types of data, some coming from the healthcare system and some coming from other aspects of data, environmental data, the built environment, employment, and the like. So I think this is a really exciting time for the UK because we are uniquely positioned to take advantage of that. And when you look at our digital capabilities in the UK, there's only one other country in the world that kind of competes with this, and that's South Korea. And I don't see a lot of people rushing off to South Korea to do this kind of work for a variety of not so complicated reasons. We've got data assets on 65 million people. The GP record is really crucially important, and that's becoming, as you know, increasingly available. And there's quite a lot of structured data. There's coded hospital data and outpatient data from the HES data set. There's pathology data in the spine, which we hope will soon be populated with digital pathology data, which will make it much more accessible for the AI people. We've got a whole set of cohorts, of course, as well. UK Biobank, the new 5 million cohort, Million Women Study, as well as international cohorts that feed into this. We've got a set of registries, the Cancer Registry, which is run by PhD, is a good example. We're proposing genomic enrichment in 5 million people to add to the information we're getting from GEL and networks for digital pathology. And then on the other side of the formula, of course, we have terrific AI. The big universities in the southeast, Oxford, Cambridge, and the London universities all have very strong AI capabilities. The Turing Institute is very powerful. The Big Data Institute also has great capabilities. We've also got, I think now, a pretty secure view about how we do large-scale federation of data. And we've been through a variety of models about how we might do this, but I think we're now increasingly aware of what the methodology that will work in that space. There are national standards, and we have NHS Digital, who are the data governance piece of this whole story to make sure that data is used appropriately in line with patient interest. The digital imaging story I won't spend a lot of time with, except that there was a competition run about a year ago. We've got a number of centers around the country doing digital pathology and digital radiology. This shows the power of this methodology because with a set of digitized scanned pathology slides, you can pretty rapidly get to a diagnosis which is at least as good as what a pathologist will do. In one of the early examples of this, which came out of Daphne Kohler's lab in Stanford, if you took the breast cancer slides from breast cancer patients who had died after 5 years and those who had lived after 5 years, broke them into a set of different different units of information which you could score, you can then let the computer decide what's the difference between the two slides, and you then get a predictive algorithm which can then run new sets of slides to see what you get to. And their result was they were about 30% better than your average pathologist in getting to the answer about whether you had good or bad prognosis disease. So you can see this is going to be massive. Combine it with genetics, it becomes even more massive. And I think we've now got a national system that will be able to roll this out over time. There's a huge excitement about improving the efficiency of clinical development. This has been talked about for a very long time. I think we're beginning to do this at scale now. It is now possible to recruit to trials using digitized recruitment and data capture in that setting. And it should also be possible to identify outcomes. And this is a huge opportunity for regulators because regulators, I think, have waited for this time to come for a very long time because it breaks down the old model of clinical trials where everything needed to be ticked on a clipboard by a clinical research associate all over the world. This can now be done digitally, and it can largely become done virtually. There's a lot of collaborations in this space with IMI, with the Verily people, and there is an exemplar running, and the goal of that exemplar is to reduce late-stage studies by more than 50%, and it looks like that'll be easily possible, and in fact, it looks now like it may be possible to reduce the cost of very late-stage pivotal studies of 15 or 30,000 patients by up to 90%. NHS Digital is really central to this agenda, but it looks like it's now beginning to happen in the UK. So we've got this melee of different programs, and one of the things that frustrates people say, look, it's all terrific, but you got one of these, you got one of those, one of those. And there's no single mechanism to get your arms around all that. So what we're trying to do is to develop a coherent national strategy in which you put all those things together. Now, it was a great deal easier to make this slide than it was to actually pull it all together, just to be clear. But there does have to be a strategy to have a common portal, a common mechanism to get access to the very rich data that sits in all these different domains. And I think that's part of our new federated data strategy that we hope we'll be able to roll out over the course of the next year or two. Now, this is a crib from data that I got from Mike Standing at Deloitte, because they've done some rather nice work looking at how you spend money in the US healthcare system, and it's not a lot of difference to today, and to us today. And as you can see, quite a lot of the money at the moment is either spent on symptomatic relief in late-stage disease, or it's spent a bit on disease-modifying therapies. But there's almost nothing today spent on curative therapies, and actually very little spent on preventative therapies. And I think it's pretty clear that for a healthcare system of the future, given the problems of sustainability, that's all going to shift. And so the predictions from Mike and his team is that if you look across to 2040, you see this really dramatic shift, because we will get more curative therapies, and we will get more preventative therapies that work. And there may be quite a substantial shift. Now, that's a big challenge for regulators, because both regulators and HTA and payers need to deal with a very different world about how do you quantitate this, how do you measure it, how do you really properly regulate preventative therapies where the impact may be 30 years down the line, These are really hard problems, and they're ones where you need really good and innovative regulators to work with the system. Now, with all that in mind about this shift of healthcare to a very much more preventative model where you try and cure people by intervening early, or you try and prevent disease in those populations, we have now launched, or are beginning to launch, the 5 million cohort, which is a large population cohort designed to try and tackle these problems about how do you get early diagnosis to work, and how do you get prevention based on a risk profile to work more effectively. And the reasons for doing it are shown on this slide. Obviously, we are good at cohorts, there's no doubt about it. We've got this digital linkage, which I've talked about. There are a whole set of new diagnostic platforms, circulating tumor DNA, proteomics, metabolomics, a variety of things that will help us do this if we can get a hold of the high-risk populations. AI is going to be central for a new Bayesian approach to diagnostics, where you start with a prior probability and you add stuff on top to find the people who are likely to have the disease. Polygenic risk scores, which is the aggregation of common variants, which I talked about a minute ago, will be central. And we have programs in the UK that recruit very large numbers of people anyway, and so one can actually develop these studies off the back of that. And we've actually, at some level, already done the experiment to say, if you intervene early, what can you do to these chronic diseases? The best example, of course, is the impact we've had on cardiovascular mortality by interventions in people with hypertension and high cholesterol levels. These are risk factors. In asymptomatic people, that intervention has contributed a lot to the 70% reduction in cardiovascular mortality we've seen in the past 40 years. That's a massive success for the medical profession. If you intervene early in cancer, stage 1 or stage 2, you have this massive shift in survival rates. And so the goal must be not to develop more drugs for late-stage cancer. It must be to how do you diagnose people early, intervene early, and actually make the healthcare system work better. Now, I've already mentioned the technology that's going to help us do this. Polygenic risk scores, $20 a pop. You can tell exactly who's at risk of what and to what extent with pretty significant odds ratios. Wearables, which we're all into, and we're working closely with Apple. New imaging technologies, liquid biopsies for cancer, a whole range of new technologies that we fill up about 3 of these slides in the context of the NHS. And one of the points I make to people is you can't do this study anywhere else, because when you find stuff, somebody has to look after it. And most insurance-based systems do not want you fishing around to find people with early diagnosis, because they know if they just wait a bit longer, it'll be somebody else's problem and they won't have to pay for it. So I think there are really compelling arguments for doing this here. Just very briefly about polygenic risk scores. This has been a huge enabler for this project. You can identify, well, whatever percentage of the population at high risk. Usually between 2 and 7% of the population have odds ratios of more than 3. These are pretty profound. These are monogenic risk levels of risk in most common diseases. These risks are additive to the known risk factors, so it gives you more on top of smoking and some of the other known risk factors. They should be modifiable with interventions, things like statin or changing your screening programs for cancer, and should be really helpful in the public health agenda. So you can see here, if you look at the distribution, these things come out as a normal distribution. If you go to the extreme right of the bell-shaped curve, you can choose a population of people who actually have very high risks based on the aggregation of 3,000 or 4,000 SNPs in whom they will have the addition of tiny risks all added together to give them what are actually very significant risks. And that unlocks quite an opportunity. And this is a slide from a Nature Genetics paper in February. This is all quite new. But you can see if you just take an odds ratio of 3, you can see that 8% of the population have odds ratios of more than 3 based on polygenic risk scores for coronary artery disease. So that's pretty eye-watering. If you don't like an odds ratio of 3, which incidentally is the same odds ratio as familial hypercholesterolemia, which we all know to be pretty profound, and you want to go to an odds ratio of 4, then 2.3% of the population is an odds ratio of 4. And if you get down to an odds ratio of 5, which is roughly the likelihood of being hit by a truck if you lie down in the M40, it's about 0.5% of the population. So you know where we're going here. These people need interventions. They need interventions not at 55. They need interventions because you can detect these risks at birth. they need interventions at 30 or 40 that will actually give us another really deep trough in our inflection point for risk of cardiovascular disease. And you can see this is true with breast cancer, colorectal cancer, inflammatory bowel disease, and the likes. These are really powerful examples. I like to show this because this is a Cell paper published by an American group, sorry, Nature Genetics paper published by an American group, where they looked at the polygenic risk score for obesity, several thousand variants associated with obesity. You take the highest risk population and the lowest risk population, and you look at their differential in weight from birth. They weigh about the same at birth. The high-risk guys are a little bit heavier. But by the time you're 8 years old, there's a 3.5 kg difference between the high and the low-risk population. And by the time you hit 18, that difference is 12.3 kgs. So that's 28 pounds by the time you're 18. So if anybody thought that the solution to obesity is dropping into patients who are in their 30s and 40s to get them to go on a diet, they just need to look at this data. That is absolutely not going to work. This is hard programmed from birth. We need to know about it, we need to know what to do about it, and we need to think hard about it. So the early diagnostic cohort is really focused on these two domains of trying to get diagnostic tools to diagnose disease earlier and intervene earlier to try and flatten the morbidity curve, and to try and identify populations of patients early so that we can do public health interventions with digital tools. And this is just a slide that shows how we're going to collect the data and the patient populations. Now, people always roll their eyes and say, well, you never collect 5 million people. Well, we've got a variety of tactics to do that. We've got really strong support from NHS Blood and Transplant. They see about 1 million people a year. NHS Health Check sees 1.5 million people a year. We've got a plan to put up pop-up clinics, and we can use some of the existing cohorts to do this as well. So we're pretty confident we can get to 5 million people, and there'll be a consented cohort with blood samples, DNA done, polygenic risk scores from the get-go. So that's pretty exciting. And of course, we will also be able to use digital tools, not just to enroll and consent these people, but also to recontact them, to bring them into studies. And of course, one of the interesting things is that despite the fact that I think the medical profession has had quite a hard time with the behavioral modification agenda over a long period of time, this has proved to be really hard. The people who really do know how to modify behavior are the digital guys. And boy, do they know how to modify behavior. So the real question is, can we enlist them, and we are doing that at the moment, to see whether you can get them to help change people's behavior in ways that we know will benefit their health. So if you have a high-risk population, you can weigh in with a whole variety of different tools. And when you look at this kind of data, which comes from you and Ashley at Stanford, the use of one of these watches to track how many steps you're taking and what you're doing in terms of exercise, and also reminding you and giving you cues. And at its extreme, the Apple approach is to give you the watch, and if you obey the instructions every month for 2 years, you can have the watch for free. And if you don't, you've got to give the watch back. These are the kind of alignment of incentives that actually make people change their behavior. And that produces really stunning improvements in activity. In the Apple study of 20,000 people, it increased activity by 34% and gave an average increased life expectancy of 2 years in that population over a relatively short time frame. So I'm pretty optimistic about that, and that's another domain that I think we really want to work hard on. We're going to build an industry around this. People say, well, what's the industry in public health? Well, I can tell you there's a massive industry in public health, because being able to keep people fit longer and avoid the diseases they're at high risk for, I think is going to be a massive opportunity, as will the early diagnosis thing. So further to the report, we got a lot of support from government to try and think about how we shift the amount of R&D that comes into the country. At the moment, as you can see, Great Britain's quite low down in the ranks. It's got some good neighbors. Canada's down about the same place as is Norway, but we're a little bit closer to Italy than you'd like to be, and then it gets steadily worse. What we'd really like to be is in the right-hand piece of this, which are Finland, Denmark, Sweden, China, Japan, Korea, Israel. These are the really intensive R&D environments. Now, a lot of this R&D money comes from industry. So this is not, when I show this slide, academics rub their hands together and say it's all going to be terrific. The truth is, if we don't up the game in terms of industrial spend for R&D in the country, we'll never get to what we want to get to, which is the upper quartile, that line that sits across which is 2.5% roughly of GDP. So to do that, we have to build some companies. And so the goal of the strategy was to try and building 4 companies worth more than 20 billion in the UK. We gave ourselves 10 years to do that. I got a couple of companies that are worth 4 billion. It'll be tight to get to 4 in 10 years, but it's not impossible. So that's the ambition, and we're going to keep going on that. There have been a lot of new incentives from Treasury to actually invest in the capital base for these companies. The access to the money in the city is going to be increasingly important. The tax environment in the UK is as good as any country in the world. It's 9% net, including the patent box, which is pretty good. We need to improve the effectiveness of the public capital markets. They don't, the public markets don't work in the UK. And what the Americans did in 1975, which really changed their environment, was that they changed the prudent man rule for pension funds. So what most of you don't know is all that money you've been saving up in your pension is currently being invested largely in gilts and bonds that are returning about 1.5% a year in terms of interest. That's why your pensions are not worth anything. So, and one of the reasons for that is the government has said, for goodness sakes, don't invest the pension money in anything interesting, stick it in bonds and everything will be fine. Well, the truth is that doesn't work. So there is now a move to lift our prudent man rule to get the pension funds to invest a little bit more widely in some of these different domains. And the consultation with the Treasury was the one that really drove that initiative forward. And one of the things that's happened in the last week is government has been rather helpful in helping to provide us with money for late-stage development, financing for companies that are well advanced but haven't quite caught over the finish line. Because up to now, we've had no money for that. So this is so-called growth capital. It's for Series B and beyond. Government's given us 200 million. We can turn that into £1 billion of risk capital that we think will actually help turn some of our emerging companies into real companies. I mentioned nucleic acid-based therapies. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. These are interfering RNA, DNA, and AAV gene therapy. Genetic medicine is going to be the next big domain. The UK is uniquely positioned to do that. We need to develop the whole system to support discovery, development, regulation, manufacturing, and implementation. There's a nucleic acid therapies accelerator, which has just been funded by the MRC at Harwell. We've got established success in this area, but 3 of the best gene therapy companies in the world, Nightstar, which was just bought by Biogen this year, Orchard Therapeutics, which is based in London, and Oxford Biomedical, which is the biggest lentivirus viral manufacturing facility in the world. And we're currently collaborating with companies like the Medicine Company on new forms of siRNA that are going to be very impactful in big indications as well as small ones. So now the meaty bit, and that is, where does regulation fit in all this? So what I'd like to start with is reminding you that innovative regulation fundamentally underpins innovation across the whole sector. And when the regulators move, the entire sector follows. And I'll give you 2 very good indications. One was when the regulators changed the orphan disease legislation to say, we totally get it. There are people who've got rare diseases. They need drugs too. We're going to make it easier to get things approved. And they changed the legislation. There has then been a massive gold rush into that space with many terrific products coming. I mean, the new SMA data is just eye-wateringly good. The CF data is good too. There's some issues there, but the CF data is good. And the Huntington's data looks terrific, at least if you can use the biomarker. That looks very exciting. So these are diseases that we never thought we would get close to curing, and we're now really in good shape in that space. The other example is breakthrough designation. So the FDA, to their credit, said, this is all too slow, guys. It takes forever to get new drugs, particularly in the cancer domain. So the definition of breakthrough designation has actually dramatically changed the speed at which companies can go to first-in-man to an approval. And that, in many settings, is 30, 35 months to get across the finish line. And there has then followed this massive wave of really interesting innovation in the cancer space. And I think, you know, the optimism that now surrounds the use of the new immuno-oncology drugs is entirely driven, I think, from the changes in the regulatory environment that made people excited to allow them to invest, to allow new innovation to occur. So innovation is essential if you're going to create a system that drives economic growth and delivers products to patients faster. And I've often said that regulators have two jobs. They need to make sure drugs that are registered are efficacious and safe. That's their first job. But their second job is to make sure stuff gets to patients quickly. And over the years, they've kind of forgotten that. Some regulators worse than others. But it's, you know, we need to get back to the fundamentals of what we want to do. So where are we now? So we are at a pretty key point for the future of the MHRA. And, you know, people may not want to talk about it because they're afraid it's going to get in the newspapers, but I'm going to talk about it rather more openly. Let's pretend we leave Europe. That's a premise. You know, we may not, but let's start with that because, you know, there's no point in talking about the other because we know what will happen if we stay and that everything will go back to the way it was, hopefully. But if you're outside Europe, there's really two broad ways you could operate. One is you could be a partner with the EMA and take a sort of EEA status, sort of Norway-type status, where you can be a rapporteur, you can read the folders, and then they kick you out of the room and vote. It's sort of okay. Not sure that's where I'd want to be, but you know, it might work. Or you can be an observer, in which you can observe, but you can't sit at the table, and then, but they might, if you're lucky, give you a cup of tea before you get in the plane and come back to London. But you'll have no say in anything. And that is absolutely not where you want to be. And it's absolutely not where the UK what the UK needs to drive its innovation in the life sciences domain. And then there's the other model, which is the plan B, and that is the MHRA decides to be an independent regulator. And I have to say that has many attractions, got many challenges. I totally get it. We're a small market. There's a risk that no one would come. But at the same time, there's also, I think, quite a substantial opportunity. And that is that regulation is actually getting much more complicated. And the regulators don't do all this stuff very well because it's hard. And it needs people to spend the time to think hard with innovators about how you regulate things like algorithms. So everyone says, well, algorithms, that should be easy. Well, actually, the truth is they're not easy. And you know, things like drift and things like biasing algorithms, learning algorithms that change every minute of every day, how are you going to regulate those? This is a really challenging problem. We need a smart set of regulators to do this. And I was at Babylon visiting them last week, and I said, how's it going? And they said, well, you know, we're getting algorithms, but we have no idea how to get them approved and regulated to get them used in the healthcare system. Gene editing, another good example. All the genomic medicine technologies, you're going to need hands-on support to make this stuff work. Nucleic acid-based therapies broadly are going to be a really important domain because it's the new generation. And remember, antibodies were not all that easy to regulate in the early days because there's lots of stuff, you know, all the way from the manufacturing through to what you need to measure and how you need to measure. Bioequivalence is a crucial and important bit. Now, you could rely on other agencies for routine decisions. FDA and EMA will be making decisions. And that could be done by some form of targeted assessment or even automatic recognition. And that would speed up. I don't think the MHRA should be trying to regulate the fourth new antidepressant that comes out this year or the new statin that's got slightly different bioavailability. I think they need to concentrate on things where innovation is really at the cutting edge. And my very strong recommendation is focus on that and let the other regulators do the really routine and rather boring stuff. And then when they say, okay, you know, you can bang a stamp on it and everything should be fine. Concentrate on speed and efficiency. You know, industry really is frustrated by the lack of pace, particularly in the European regulators. It's really bureaucratic and it's really slow. And I think it wouldn't take the MHRA much to be much faster and much quicker. Novel approaches for accelerated approval and breakthrough. Collaborating on new endpoints. Raj Long is here. She and I did a lot of brainstorming. If you're going to solve dementia, you need totally new endpoints. You need totally new validated endpoints. You need regulators to sitting with innovators to say, how are we going to do this? Trials are long, they're complicated. We need to get that to work. The digital world changes everything. I'll come to that in a minute. And you really want approval and safety to be associated with the ongoing process of data generation. Because in a world where you're generating data all the time, the right way to do safety is to be monitoring safety continuously in the marketplace, not saying, well, you've done a study with 3,000 patients, it's all fine because nobody dropped dead. You won't know anything really until you've treated 50 or 100,000 patients with the appropriate drug. And finally, I think there is another opportunity for the MHRA, and that is around global health. The global health regulatory environment is really not fit for purpose at the moment. It's slow, it's clunky. Lots of people who really need medicines and new interventions don't get them because there's a very, very slow process, largely managed by the WHO, which doesn't work. And so having a northern regulator who paid attention to the developing world would be broadly welcome. So there's also a kind of sociology to this, because the conventional regulator has been, up to now, a sort of policeman. You know, blow the whistle, give them a ticket, put a black label on, or black box on the drug, all that kind of stuff. You know, that's sort of all fine, but for some of these big challenges, there are other forms of regulation out there. And you know, there's a good example because, you know, the air traffic control system is essentially a regulatory system. But it's different because the air traffic controllers work with the pilots to land the planes safely. They talk to each other, they say, well, why don't you go on the left runway, not the right runway, because you're more likely to be successful if you do that. And you know, there's an ongoing discussion and a collaboration where they work together to make sure the thing all works together. And you know, if the air traffic controllers say stop, go around another 4 times, then they say stop, go around another 4 times. So, you know, there are ways to do regulation which are different, and I think we've kind of locked ourselves into a model which isn't necessarily in the modern world the right one. The digital world changes everything, and as I said earlier, we are in a unique position in the UK because we are moving towards comprehensive medical records across the whole data set around the NHS. We, I think, have a real play in real-world evaluation of safety as well as efficacy. We can do digital clinical trials, recruiting with NHS Digital, generating outcomes via electronic records. We haven't done that yet, but there's absolutely no reason you can't do it, and the modeling looks very, very positive in that space. Cost of pivotal trials could be dramatically reduced, and hence the cost of drugs should be dramatically reduced. That's the major cost of drugs in the system. And there needs to be a national program which incorporates the MHRA that allows them to do that at scale and work with innovators to say what's the right kind of study to do. And you know, we got many of the components there already. You can do registries and device tracking. This is a headache for the industry. How do you track devices in the real world? The right way to do that is to make sure everybody who gets a device gets the serial number and the device registered in their EHR, and then you can track it with the push of a return key. Similarly with registries with drugs. We can do that. No one else in the world can do it because they've got a heterogeneous healthcare system where you won't be able to track the patients. Focus on speed, flexibility, and collaboration. Digital allows you to do that, setting global standards. So if you just go back to my 3 domains and you say, well, independent regulator, how does that work? Well, in each one of those, I can't do any of those 3 new industries without the help of a regulator. And this is, I think, a really compelling argument, because I can't wait for years to get input. In genomics, we need to regulate an expanding set of genetic tests where the indications change daily and the tools change daily. You can't do that through the FDA, and you soon will not be able to do it through the EMA, because the new EU IVD legislation is going to deeply constrain our ability to operate in this space. We need to test new forms of genetic testing, and we need to be able to use these Bayesian approaches to see whether testing works in the context of a whole set of other prior probabilities. In digital health, I've mentioned the regulation of algorithms, bias drift, and learning algorithms, but also changing the tools using digital health for measuring efficacy, real-world data. And again, in the early diagnosis space, we need different approaches to thinking about how a test is used in a wider context of both risk and also subsequent tests that can be applied. And we also need to think about how you evaluate early therapeutic interventions in patients who have got the very earliest stages of disease to know that they are truly efficacious and worth spending money on. That is a really hard problem. And also to try and test and evaluate public health interventions. So I'll give you one really quick example, and then I'll sit down and take some questions. But we're working with the medicines company at the moment, and this, by we, I mean everybody. NHS England, OLS, NICE, MHRA. This is a great company. It's a mid-sized company. They've got the siRNA specific for PCSK9, so it inhibits PCSK9. People with a genetic mutation PCSK9 essentially don't get cardiovascular disease. This is a fantastic product, and the reason it's fantastic is because it's administered by injection, and it could probably be injected, it could be given to people once a year, and it's cheap. I can't tell you how cheap, because that's subject to commercial negotiation, but I can tell you it's cheap. And so this changes the world of cardiovascular risk management. And when the first news of their trials came out, one of the great things about it is it pushed Brexit off the front page. I'd much rather read about 1 or 2 jabs a day replacing statins than the Brexit phenomena. So, and this is the data that they released in Paris about a month ago. It shows that there's a 54% reduction in LDL cholesterol. You can see the efficacy, but the important thing about this is not that it works. I mean, it's amazing that it works with almost no adverse effects, but this is now a vaccine for the prevention of cardiovascular disease. So can you see where I'm going? Polygenic risk scores, highest 5%, start at the age of 30, injection every year, save your life, terrific. Where's the only place in the world that can do it? The UK. Where do you need a regulator who can think about that? Because it's a completely different paradigm. It's got to be the UK. Where do you have a healthcare system that can actually do those sorts of programs and deals? It's the UK. So I don't think we need to be depressed that people are going to forget about us. Oh, that's just in case anybody said, what about the liver function test? Anyway, they're all fine. So I think the UK and the MHRA could lead in this evaluation and adoption of these kind of novel new medicines. New trial design. The trials here are being all done digitally. Implementation is being done in a completely different way. New preventative therapies. There's been coordination between NICE, MHRA, and NHS. And to be clear, no one can make this stuff because you need tons of this. And so we're going to be the best in the world at making this, which will make us the place to come if you want to do siRNA at scale with tons of material coming out. We'll have the most up-to-date manufacturing. And obviously the ability to do long-term follow-up, because that's what you got to do if you're going to treat people from the age of 30. So to conclude, we really do have a unique opportunity in this space of life sciences. Lots of people have been working together on this. It's a terrific example. Academia, industry, government, and the NHS have all been linked into this story. Regulatory innovation is always crucial for rapid advancements in healthcare. And to be honest, I fret most about the pace of change in the European regulatory system. It's almost going backwards. Thirdly, Brexit is likely to challenge the status quo, at least in this country. And we need to, I think, just swallow it, guys. That is the way it's going to be. And there remains, actually, I think, even in that environment, a really exciting role for you.